Hello, my name is Philippe Beauregard. I will talk today about narcissistic leadership strategies. I seek with this research to better understand the consequences of narcissism, especially for foreign policy making on issues of international cooperation and military intervention. This work is still in early stages, so my presentation is going to focus on reviewing the literature and interesting paths for theory. There has recently been a spike of interest in narcissism in the wake of the presidency of Donald Trump, with a great many books and articles written on the danger of Trump's narcissism. Trump has been accused of sabotaging cooperation with close allies and criticized for impulsive and dangerous foreign policy decisions. However, no matter what it seems, as I will show in this presentation, the consequences of narcissism for foreign policy are not simple or straightforward. I begin my presentation with a quick review of the literature to show the limits of previous work on narcissism. In the second part, I will explain my main argument that dynamic self-regulation approaches to narcissism offer a promising path for future research. I argue that instead of focusing on whether or not a leader is a narcissist, we should instead focus on when leaders employ narcissistic strategies. I will present some of these narcissistic leadership strategies in the last part. Most of the research on the concept can be placed into two categories: psychoanalytical biographies and what I label quantitative work, where researchers develop indicators to rate political leaders and see how their narcissism correlates with other variables. The first research program in what is most of the work in international politics has been psychoanalytical biographies, focused on policymakers, especially American presidents. This research usually identifies some trauma or difficulty in early life. It shows that these childhood traumas lead to an enduring pattern of narcissistic behavior for the person and how it eventually impacts their decision as political leaders. Lemma Steinberg, for example, in her book argues that Lyndon Johnson's insecurities, rooted in his childhood, made him obsessed with the fear of humiliation and the need to prove that he was not a coward, which influenced his decision to escalate US involvement in Vietnam. Psychoanalytic biographies associate narcissism with foreign policy fiascos like Vietnam. They argue that highly narcissistic presidents are more aggressive and likely to direct their rage into international interventions, and that narcissism hinders effective cooperation. Conversely, quantitative work on narcissism finds a correlation between ratings of narcissism and the historians' ratings of the greatness of presidents. As an example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt often ranks very high in narcissism and is also often categorized as one of the greatest American presidents. Quantitative works also finds a correlation between high levels of narcissism and war avoidance. Narcissistic presidents tend to avoid launching new interventions or wars. So we see inconsistency between the results of these two research programs. This inconsistency carries on to recent works on international cooperation that have focused on the interpersonal and emotional aspect of cooperation. For example, Holmes and Wheeler, who study interpersonal bonding in diplomacy, write that individuals with narcissistic personalities are less likely to develop mutual focus of attention and shared mood that require not seeing the other as a manifestation of the self, but feeling their interests and concerns. High narcissism therefore hinders the process of bonding because narcissists are too self-centered and lack empathy, so that they logically find it more difficult to connect and form a positive social bond. Recent work by Keyes and York suggests something very different. They studied Kissinger's diplomacy in 1971 in normalizing and improving relations with China. They find that Kissinger's narcissism was a key motivator for him and that it shaped how he conducted diplomacy. He wanted to impress Chinese leaders and show his personal worth and went beyond strategic considerations at the time, even revealing US intelligence to the Chinese without proper authorization. And so this motivation was a key factor in the success of Kissinger's diplomacy regarding China. So one major difficulties of current literature is that scholars disagree on the political consequences of narcissism. Another major difficulty is that politicians, especially top leaders like heads of state, almost always have a fairly high level of grandiose narcissism. It becomes difficult to argue that narcissism made the difference in one case and not the other. Another issue is inconsistency even for each individual leader, with some narcissistic leaders behaving in non-narcissistic manners in some circumstances. So my main argument is that political scholars have much to gain in shifting to a dynamic self-regulation conception of narcissism. This approach understands personality as a stable system that attempts to regulate how people manage their social environment. It makes three big moves, important moves for studying narcissism. It argues that each person has his or her own system of emotions and beliefs, so emotional beliefs, and that these will importantly shape their behavior. Second, it shows that behavior emerges from the interaction between the personality of a single individual and his social circumstances. Narcissism is thus characterized by ideal-typical patterns, which I call strategies in this presentation, for a person to protect his or her ego in interacting with his or her social surroundings. This perspective is interesting because it shifts the question away from the question of whether a policymaker is narcissistic or not, to instead focus on when do leaders use narcissistic strategies. This means that leaders who are not narcissistic may sometimes find it politically useful to employ a narcissistic strategy. This approach is also open to personality changes. Narcissism is not frozen from childhood onwards, like in the psychoanalytic approach, but policymakers can draw lessons from an event that changes their perspective. So now let's discuss a few of these narcissistic leadership strategies. The first strategy I want to discuss is decisiveness. Decisiveness is a strategy where leaders are impulsive, quick to decide, they choose bold policies, and they defend their point of view with absolute certainty. Decisive leaders look strong, assertive, effective to outside observers. The strategy can be dangerous when deciding on foreign interventions and can lead to major disagreements when partners disagree with the leader's decisions. A very decisive leader that comes to mind is George W. Bush and his intervention in Iraq. Bush benefited from appearing strong in a post 9/11 context, but he also created conflict with close allies, and the intervention was criticized for being rushed and badly prepared. The second self-regulation strategy is dramatization. The strategy entails the leader doing everything to capture attention, making exaggerated claims, using colorful or vulgar language, making accusations, or other boisterous performances. Leaders who dramatize also often accuse the press and feel the need to completely control their message and their image. Dramatization quiets the leader's inner doubts, and it gains them a great advantage in a world where many political actors compete for attention. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a master of dramatization. He cautiously calculated his appearances, coined slogans such as "nothing to fear but fear itself," and would directly speak to the American people in his radio addresses. FDR wanted absolute control over his image, and he constantly berated the media. These skills at dramatization are a great advantage for a leader who must mobilize society in facing a great crisis, as FDR did during the Great Depression and the Second World War. However, dramatization may become a curse, with the leader constantly in need of another bold new move to capture attention. Third, gaslighting is a form of emotional manipulation where the gaslighter attempts to make the target doubt their judgment and even their own sanity. In this strategy, gaslighters try to make believe the illusion that they are greatly successful rather than actually improving their performance. They not only lie and manipulate, but they defend their own alternate reality, as though they believed in it. They cling to this alternate reality to protect their ego and exploit others, forcing them to submit to their domination over what is true and what is not. While Trump has been called gaslighter-in-chief, he was by no means the only president to gaslight his national and international partners. Ronald Reagan was famous for making all kinds of stories about his life that were actually scenes from movies that he had seen, not to mention his acute distortion of reality during the Iran-Contra scandal. Gaslighting can compromise relationships with international partners who do not live in this alternate reality, and over the long run, destroy the credibility of a political leader. Last strategy is strategic aggression. Researchers in social psychology have found that narcissistic individuals do not project their anger against any easy target. They only strategically attack targets that they perceive as a threat to their own ego. Narcissistic rage tends to be vengeful, persistent, and of a very high intensity, with leaders willing to take a high level of risk to defeat and humiliate their enemies. More research is necessary to find out when strategic aggression leads to military intervention and hinders cooperation, and when it does not. An interesting case of aggression derailing cooperation is found in Alexander and Juliet George's biography of President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson virulently attacked everyone, Republicans in Congress, his European counterparts, and turned against his own advisors, even when it clearly went against his own goal of the United States joining the League of Nations. To conclude, the 4 narcissistic leadership strategies suggest that the inconsistencies observed in studies of narcissism may actually stem from increased variability, rather than a clear direction toward fiascos or greatness. Indeed, recent work on CEOs of big companies show that narcissistic leaders bring about more variability in outcomes, with great success and great failures. Narcissistic leaders go all in. They are decisive, ambitious, dramatic, willing to distort reality and take risks to attain their goals, which rarely yields middle-of-the-road political outcomes. Further research is needed to figure out how each strategy is employed and successful in which circumstances. The dynamic self-regulation approach presented here is promising because it allows political researchers to go beyond childhood traumas and psychoanalytical approaches. It makes it possible to study both the positive and negative side effects of narcissistic strategies and to understand how narcissists differ in the strategies that they use. Thank you very much for your attention. Feel free to contact me for questions or details on the books or articles that I referenced in my presentation.